Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and get you truly well-informed. And this week, wow, the headlines are just everywhere. It feels like the nation's really on edge. Just yesterday, the Senate confirmed a pretty controversial nominee to the Federal Reserve. Super tight vote, 48-47, very partisan.
Right down the line.
And then just hours later, you have this divided appeals court stepping in, blocking President Trump's attempt to remove a sitting Fed governor.
Yeah, Lisa Cook, that's a huge development. It looks like that one's heading for the Supreme Court.
Definitely seems that way. And all of this is happening, right now, as the Federal Open Market Committee kicks off its two-day meeting today.
And everyone expects them to cut interest rates, right?
That's the consensus, yeah. Even though, get this, new data shows price inflation ticked up again in August. Hit 2.9%, an 8-month high.
Wow. So inflation up, but job creation is slowing way down, only 22,000 new jobs.
Exactly. It's a real disconnect. The political stakes, they feel unprecedented, and the economic fallout could be massive. So what if the very institution designed to, guide our economy, keep it stable, is now caught right in the middle of intense political fighting? Does that put your savings, the whole country's financial future, at risk? For a lot of you watching the Fed closely, these questions about its real priorities are getting louder.
They really are.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into the Federal Reserve. It's so central to our economic lives, but it's facing these just extraordinary challenges to its independence right now. We're going to unpack the legal fights, the controversial appointments, the big economic decisions putting the Fed under the microscope. We'll draw on insights from sources like Breitbart, the Mises Institute, and the Cato Institute. And you'll see how these challenges aren't just about, complex monetary policy. It's really a fundamental fight over who controls our economic future.
And ultimately the value of your money.
Exactly. So let's get into it.
It's definitely a critical time. The Fed's role is so foundational. But seeing its independence challenged so openly, it's something else. What's really striking is how these political pressures are slamming right into the economic data. It creates this really complex, volatile situation.
That collision is the perfect place to start. This battle for control, this challenge to the idea of Fed independence itself. Traditionally, the Fed's supposed to be insulated,
right,
like separate from politics.
Right. Governors get those long 14-year terms. You can only remove them for cause. It's designed to keep monetary policy stable, away from short-term political wins.
But President Trump hasn't really followed that tradition. He's been very public, very critical, calling Fed Chair Powell Jerome Too Late Powell for not cutting rates fast enough.
That's not just background noise. It's direct, very public pressure.
It feels like a real departure. Presidents have tried to nudge the Fed before, but this seems different, more overt.
It does. And this administration's approach seems, two-pronged. You've got the direct attempt to remove a governor, Cook, and then at the same time, appointing someone seen as very aligned with the administration, Stephen Murin. Both moves seem aimed at reshaping the Fed's traditional autonomy.
Okay, let's break down those two cases because they're huge. First, the attempt to remove Governor Lisa Cook. The president declared cause, citing alleged issues with her mortgage applications from before she was even appointed.
Right, pre-appointment conduct.
But then the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals just blocked her removal, emphasizing due process. They said she wasn't given notice, no chance to respond.
And that's key. The court basically said, look, Fed governors aren't at-will employees. They have a right to their job unless there's proven cause. So taking that away requires due process notice, a hearing, a chance to defend herself, which they found she didn't get here.
But there was dissent, right?
Oh, yeah. A strong dissent from Judge Gregory Katsas. He argued that misconduct before appointment, like fraud, absolutely is cause. An excellent reason, he called it. He also warned that letting courts second-guess this could tie the president's hands for months, even years, and that allows a, quote, potentially compromised Fed official to cling to power. So, really high stakes.
You can see both sides of that argument constitutionally. And Fed governors have real power over interest rates, over policy. So this isn't trivial.
Not at all. And like you said, it probably goes to the Supreme Court next.
So that's one front, trying to remove a governor. The other is adding a new one, Stephen Murin, top economic advisor to President Trump, just confirmed in that razor-thin Senate vote.
48-47. Pure party lines, basically.
What's really raising eyebrows, though, is that he plans to keep his White House job as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. He'll be on unpaid leave, but not resigning.
Which is just not how it's usually done. Think about Ben Bernanke. He resigned his White House role when he went to the Fed.
So what's the concern there? Why is that a problem?
Well, the immediate worry for critics is about influence. Undue influence. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer put it bluntly, saying Mirren would be nothing more than Donald Trump's mouthpiece at the Fed. And adding fuel to that fire, Mirren himself has argued in the past for making it easier for presidents to remove Fed governors. He's on record saying pure independence is incompatible with a democratic system.
Okay, so his own views seem to align with weakening that independence.
Exactly, and his policy ideas, like devaluing the dollar or using tariffs, also line up pretty closely with the president's agenda. So you put the Cook situation together with the Mirren appointment, and it looks like a very concerted effort to bring the Fed more into the administration's orbit.
And this really taps into a much broader feeling you hear, especially from conservatives and libertarians, about the Fed in general, a kind of deep-seated distrust.
Absolutely. For decades, figures like Ron Paul have criticized the Fed. The core argument is often that it's this unaccountable, unelected body with enormous power over the economy.
Which clashes with a small government, free market kind of philosophy.
Right. You hear critiques like the Fed is a private company or it engages in money printing. And the big one is that this money printing silently steals wealth from regular people through inflation.
The inflation tax idea.
Precisely. And that its decisions aren't always purely economic, but sometimes politically motivated, maybe to help the current administration or benefit Wall Street. So there's this fundamental belief that such a powerful entity needs more accountability, more checks and balances, not less.
Okay, so the political independence is clearly under pressure, but let's pivot to the economic side, because that's where the rubber meets the road for most people. The Fed has this famous dual mandate. Keep employment high, keep prices stable. They aim for 2% inflation.
That's the target.
But right now, those goals seem to be pulling in opposite directions. You mentioned the job market weakening.
Yeah, only 22,000 jobs added in August. And they revised June's numbers down to show job losses. 13,000 jobs shed. That's not great.
Not great at all. But then, inflation.
It's still sticky. And rising, actually. The main CPI number hit 2.9% year over year in August. That's the highest in 8 months.
And core inflation, without food and energy.
Also up 3.1%, a 7-month high. Even the Fed's preferred measure, the PCE index, showed inflation moving up in July. Headline was 2.6%, core was 2.9%.
So you've got slowing jobs, which usually means cut rates to boost things.
Right.
But you've got rising inflation, which usually means hike rates to cool things down.
It's a classic central banker's nightmare, really. But the current political heat just turns the temperature way up on that dilemma.
And yet, despite that rising inflation, the expectation is overwhelming for a rate cut today. Quarter point down to 4 to 4.25%. Markets see it as basically a done deal, like 96% probability.
Right. Which is exactly what sources like the Mises Institute are pointing to with concern.
What's their take on why the Fed would cut rates now?
Well, the Fed might publicly say they're more worried about the job slowdown, that maybe inflation is temporary, or they need to act preemptively against a downturn. Global factors, maybe. But the Mises Institute perspective is pretty different. They argue the Fed is increasingly showing that price inflation is not even one of the central bank's chief concerns.
Oof. So what is the concern, according to them?
They claim the real concern is twofold. One, making sure the U.S. Treasury can borrow money cheaply to finance the huge national debt. And two, trying to help the administration politically by juicing the employment numbers, even if it takes, quote, ever higher levels of monetary inflation to do it.
So in this view, cutting rates now is like throwing fuel on the inflation fire, just to keep borrowing costs low and maybe goose the job market temporarily.
That's exactly the critique. They warn this leads to more monetary inflation and more upward pressure on prices. Stimulating jobs this way, they argue, just creates an illusion of increasing demand. The end result, mounting price inflation and a falling standard of living for ordinary people.
How does it hurt ordinary people specifically?
Well, this kind of monetary stimulus tends to inflate asset prices, stocks, real estate. That benefits wealthier people who own those assets. But it makes things like houses unaffordable for first-time homebuyers. And for everyone, it eats away at savings and makes everyday purchases more expensive. One source pointed out purchasing power has dropped nearly 25% in just 5 years. Think about that for your budget.
A quarter of your purchasing power gone in 5 years. That's significant.
It really is. And it feeds into that idea you mentioned earlier, the hidden agenda of debt financing.
With the national debt approaching $40 trillion and $9 trillion needing to be refinanced just this year.
Lower interest rates make a huge difference to the government's interest payments. It saves the Treasury billions.
So critics argue that's a major, maybe the major, underlying reason for the Fed keeping money easy even when inflation is rising.
That's a core argument from many conservative and libertarian sources, yes. The Cato Institute chimed in too, saying flatly, economic data does not support a Fed rate cut. They worry the Fed is making policy errors because it's not following clear rules, maybe swayed by other pressures.
It really highlights this tightrope the Fed is walking, or maybe being pushed off of. Which brings us back to the bigger picture. How does this incredibly powerful institution, facing all these pressures, actually fit within our constitutional system? Is this independence really compatible?
That's the fundamental question being raised. Groups like the Federalist Society argue that something this powerful can't be exempt from checks and balances. It's just too central.
It's not a brand new debate either.
Not at all. You mentioned Wright Patman back in the 60s, a Democrat calling an independent central bank undemocratic and against the principle of accountability. It's a long-standing tension.
The government by philosopher King's criticism that the Fed operates on these complex economic theories that change without enough direct oversight from elected officials.
Right. Like trying to fly a jumbo jet with the windows painted over and only delayed instruments, as one analogy put it. It highlights what economists like Hayek called the knowledge problem. Can any central body really know enough to manage the economy perfectly?
So how should it be accountable, according to these critics? Where does the Constitution come in?
The argument centers on Congress. The Constitution explicitly gives Congress the money power to coin money and regulate the value thereof, and the power to tax.
Okay.
Critics argue that when the Fed manages inflation, especially when it sets an inflation target, it's effectively regulating the value of money and imposing an inflation tax.
Explain that inflation tax.
It means inflation reduces the purchasing power of your dollars. That loss of purchasing power essentially transfers wealth from the people holding the money to the government and those who get the new money first, acting like a tax, but one never voted on by Congress.
And the Fed setting that 2% inflation target back in 2012 is a key example for them.
Exactly. They see that as the Fed unilaterally deciding to perpetually devalue the dollar. At 2% inflation, prices quintuple in about 80 years. Critics say that's a massive policy decision with long-term consequences, a fundamentally political choice about the nature of our money that should be made by elected representatives in Congress, not by the Fed alone.
So what's the proposed fix? More oversight. Legislation.
Yeah, there are calls for reforms, maybe a Federal Reserve Reform Act of 2025. Ideas include Congress explicitly canceling that 2% target unless and until Congress itself approves it, maybe setting a target closer to zero.
Making it clear the Fed doesn't get to decide the definition of stable money on its own.
Precisely. And also demanding more transparency and review of the Fed's own finances, especially since it's apparently lost $200 billion in the last couple of years, burning through its capital base. The goal of these reforms would be to rein in that perceived unaccountable power and bring the Fed more clearly under the constitutional system of checks and balances.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. We've seen the Fed, meant to be independent, caught in these legal fights over removing governors. We've seen concerns about political influence with this new controversial appointment. And we see the Fed poised to cut rates even though inflation is actually going up.
Right, a very tense situation.
And the sources we looked at, particularly from a conservative or libertarian angle, really emphasize concerns about the Fed's huge unelected power. They question its role in enabling government debt and point to the direct hit on your purchasing power from inflation.
Yeah, those are the core critiques.
So the decisions being made literally this week at the Fed, under all this political pressure, they're not abstract. They hit your wallet, they affect home affordability, the stability of the whole economy.
Absolutely. These aren't just Washington games.
Which leaves us with a pretty stark question, maybe a provocative thought for you to consider. In this environment, with this level of political pressure meeting these critical economic choices, can the Federal Reserve actually stay independent? Or is it inevitably becoming just another tool of political power? And if it is, what does that ultimately cost you in terms of rising prices and the value of your savings? Is that dual mandate shifting towards just one goal, the political one?
A question with profound implications for everyone.